Hi all, I'm going to go ahead and respond to this comment. So let's just get right into it. Then instead of going no contact, you should have just stood up for yourself and gave it right back to her. Then you could have had relationships with your other relatives. Oh, the urge to be snarky is so difficult to overcome sometimes, but I'm not going to do it. I'm going to be constructive. Send. That's what goes on behind the scenes sometimes, and I edit it out, but this time I'm not going to. I need people to see that it takes me a moment to find my words in a constructive way, because there are a lot of things that I would like to say to this person that wouldn't create a teachable moment. Let's put it that way. I wonder when it is I should have given it back to my mother. Should have I done it when I was 13 and I was running from her abuse and my grandfather's, by the way. My grandfather, the child molester. My grandmother was an alcoholic, the facilitator of my grandfather, and probably the queen narcissist, but my mother's the queen sociopath narcissist. Should have I given it back to her then and stood up for myself then, instead of running away from home for the final time, ending up living on the streets and losing what was left of my traumahood, because there wasn't a childhood. When I say losing what was left, I lost milestones of normalcy that I could have had otherwise, like high school, prom, graduation, being with my peers to some degree. So there were things that I definitely lost. That being said, there was something easier about being on the streets, in that the people who were abusing me out there, a vulnerable 13-year-old child on the streets of Miami, weren't supposed to love me. So should have I stood up to her then instead of running away? Or maybe at 17, when social services sent me back to my abusers, my mother specifically, not asking any questions regarding why I ran away in the first place. Not one question. Should I, when I got off that plane and entered that house, should I stood up to her then? I mean, what a great opportunity. The entire family was there. Literally the whole family was there. Do you know what the family was saying to me when I walked into the door, 17, with a 10-day-old baby, shell-shocked from all of the trauma that I had been through? You cannot imagine what I had to do, what I was forced into to survive the streets. You can't begin to imagine how traumatized I was, with this mixed feeling of so happy to be home and people actually do love me. Because when I was a runaway, there were times, one in particular that I remember very specifically, wherein I wanted to call home. And I remembered my mother's words, because I had been running away quite a lot. Like, this was my coping mechanism, was to run away. You know, if you just stay gone, everyone's just going to forget about you. I literally believed that. I believed I had so little value that when I ran away from home, nobody would remember me, and that they were better off without me. Even finding out years later from other kids who knew me at the time, how significant I was to them, and that when I ran, some of them really worried about me. The people who did look for me, which, by the way, after a year was not my mother, and my mother went through the motions. Finding out that they cared that much about me was, in this weird way, devastating, because I felt so sorry for little Marnie, thinking that she had so little value. Maybe I should have stood up to my mother then. Oh, getting back to what they said to me when I got home. I got, "I love you, I missed you," from my mother, which was shocking. And I blurted out, "You did?" And I was so happy about that. And I completely lost sight of all the reasons I had run away. All of it. I just knew I was home and I was going to be safe. And then it began. Almost every family member, and I say almost because my younger cousins didn't do this, said things like, "Do you know what you did to the family? How could you do that? You better never do that again. You don't know what you put everyone through. Papa, my grandfather, he almost had a heart attack because of you. I believed until I was 26 years old that I had the power to cause my grandfather a heart attack. And I don't know why I didn't purposely give him one. I guess because part of me loved him and part of me knew that what he was doing to me was my fault and it was all jumbled together. Maybe that's why I didn't take on that power. But I legitimately believed that that was true. Because when children are told things, particularly by their parents, from the time that they have the ability to understand the spoken word, that's their truth. Getting back to, I should have stood up to her and, saved the entire family for myself. Like, I would have had those family relationships with people who blamed me for running away from abuse, that stood with abusers. I did stand up. I stood up to my mother. I told her that my grandfather CSA'd me. I have to be careful with words I use. Sometimes things get banned. And she didn't own it. My father, she said over and over again. I told my brother that when I was 12 years old, I lost my virginity to a grape. I was 21 years old. This is after I was now no contact with my mother. I called him. I had a talk with him. I opened myself up to him. He was the first person in my family that I told, and I thought, for sure he's going to understand. He's my brother. He lived with my mother. He saw those experiences. I didn't understand at that time that we had different relationships with my mother and different needs. True to form, you're lying, Marnie. You're a liar. Everybody has always said you're a liar. I don't even know how long that phone conversation went on for, but it crushed me. But I should want a relationship with him and stand up to everybody because he's my family, right? My aunt, my favorite aunt, I'm an adult. She could have chosen me over the abusers. But as it turns out, she needs to toe the family line too. They're all connected to each other, working together. They are part of a team of abusers in all different ways. I lost my entire family. Well, I didn't actually. Let me rephrase that. I didn't lose my entire family because I didn't have them. And it took me a long time to really understand that. And just as a little side story regarding my aunt, the one who chose all of the abusers, when my son was 13 years old, because my eldest daughter had a relationship with my mother, he went with her, along with my youngest child, with my permission, to a family celebration for one of my nephews that I don't know, a bar mitzvah. And my aunt walked up to my then somewhere between, I think he was around 13 years old, my 13-year-old son. Yeah, he was definitely around 13 years old. Walked up to him, not knowing what he did or didn't know about the family estrangement, not knowing what information he did or didn't have. So for all she knew, she could have been ripping his world apart with this information. And basically said to him, do you think that your mother was actually CSA'd by my father? She had no way of knowing what my son did or didn't know. And by the way, fortunately, he did have some awareness at that point because my kids were older now and they had more history. And in saying that, I was also very careful in the information that I gave my children over the years. I made sure it was age appropriate. I had no interest in vilifying the family. I had an interest in teaching my children what love looks like and not worrying about what love doesn't look like. But she could have ripped him apart in that moment. Because imagine hearing from somebody that a person possibly hurt your mother in any way. He responded with, well, what do you think? And she said, I think something happened. Something. They know. They act like they don't, but they do. And somehow they become a part of that system. Maybe it's because they were conditioned and it's like Stockholm syndrome. I think there's an element of that. I think that some of them do carry shame for that. And I think that others are just too afraid to break free and do the right thing because they see what happens to us, the scapegoat. We're left by ourselves with no one to create our own new families and communities. And I am my children's mother, but they are not my support system. Not to say they're not supportive, but I don't look to my children to do for me what is my job, in my opinion, to do for them. And I have friends who are like family. I have one person in particular who is definitely family, and I can rely on her and her me in that way that it is that relationship that I've always craved and wanted and needed, and we're able to give that to each other. But it's not the same as having an actual family, brothers, sisters, parents, and all of that. And that void is always going to be there. And I tried everything not to end up in this situation. I did. And unfortunately, if people aren't going to own abuse, if they are going to stand with the abusers, then it leaves the survivor, who is usually the scapegoat, to realize that they have to go on and choose themselves if they're going to break the cycle of abuse. Because if we stay in it, it means that we're continuing to be abused and traumatized, and that's unacceptable. At the end of the day, I did stand up. And even if I hadn't, if I had just walked away because I no longer wanted to be connected to people who were continuing to hurt me, that would have been okay too. Stop victim blaming and shaming. That's what you've done here in your comment. I don't know or care whether or not it's intentional, because intentions mean nothing to me. What you did does mean something to me. And I hope in my speaking to you on this, it gives you a recognition for how complicated these situations are, and how we should never have to stay connected to somebody who abuses us. Standing up to them doesn't change anything. Standing up to my abuser didn't change anything. And oh, by the way, I almost forgot. I created boundaries for my mother. Boundaries around my children, boundaries around respect and love in very fawn-like ways, because I was so afraid of her, but asking her to treat my children with love and respect and being equitable, and also not, diminishing me in front of them. There were some things that were going on. I did stand up to her and ask her to stop doing those things. And ultimately, it was her continuing to do that created the no contact. It wasn't even about what she was doing to me. I didn't love myself enough at the time to save myself. But I did love my children enough to save them. And when I saw what was rolling out, that was the reason I went no contact.